Hi everyone, this is Jeremy Delacas and I'm going to tackle about sources of capital.
After going through the difficulties of drafting a business plan, entrepreneurs will be faced with the task of finding finance if they don't have enough personal cash to support the venture. Funds required by the firm can be raised either internally or externally. Internal fund sources refers to those finance that are owned by the entrepreneur or the company, whereas the external sources refers to those beyond the means of the entrepreneur or the business organization.
Aside from internal and external sources, capital may be sourced from different sources as discussed hereunder.
Let's start with formal and informal sources. Formal sources refers to borrowing funds from an organization or institution that have been lawfully authorized by the government to provide financial aid or other types of support to business and institutions. Informal sources, on the other hand, refers to funding sources other than those required by law to give capital or finance to businesses. Next is owner's equity. The contribution of the owner to the capital is known as equity in a corporation, and the holders of stock certificates are known as
Stockholders.
As the result, if funds are needed to expand the business or open a branch, the business organization can look to its owners or stockholders as an immediate source of funds, which can be accomplished through additional equity infusions or personal loans to the business as a whole. Third is long-term borrowing. Long-term borrowing is a term used to describe organizations whose primary purpose is to provide financial help. Banks and mortgages, for example, lend cash or capital with long-term repayment terms, such as 1 to 3 years for medium-term loan and 3 years or more for long-term loans. Mortgages, bonds, and long-term commercial papers are examples of possible funding sources. So what are these three? Let's start with mortgage. A mortgage is a type of loan that is obtained by pledging a specific property as security or collateral for the loan. The corporation can mortgage its equipment or real estate holdings to the bank if necessity arises. And next is bonds. In its most simplest form, bonds is a loan made by the investor to a borrower, such as a corporation or the government. The borrower owes money to run its business, while the investor earns interest on his or her investment. And the next examples of funding sources is the long-term commercial papers. Long-term commercial papers, or LCPs, are commercial documents issued by large enterprises with a track record of success. Like bonds, LCP are guaranteed a fixed return by the issuer, and so LCP holders are renting returns by purchasing the LCP, regardless of the issuer's operating results.
Good day everyone, I am Janet Ting, and in my part of this discussion I'll be discussing the short-term creditors, the types of creditors, venture capital companies, its other sources, and lastly the angel investors. I'm gonna start this with the definition of the short-term creditors. So short-term creditors takes the form of financiers on a short-term basis lasting to 1 year or less. In some cases, they include fund providers who may not demand voluminous documents like business plan or feasibility studies. These creditors can serve as a standby credit facility to the entrepreneurs, which can be tapped as needed. When properly nurtured, short-term creditors can be tapped for cash needs or inventory, even by simply using the phone or a brief visit to its offices to sign some papers. So next we move on to the types of creditors. There are 7 types of creditors: the commercial banks, merchandise suppliers, credit card companies, capital equipment suppliers, leasing companies, receivable factors, and lastly, the 7th one, deferral of payables in general. we're gonna tackle first the commercial banks. So, as its charter provides, commercial banks are duty bound to provide both short-term and long-term financing to any viable business project. While banks prefer loans and financing on a medium or long-term basis, there are special financing packages involving short-term financing for periods of 6 months or even less. For an export-oriented business, entrepreneurs should explore special financing package normally offered by export banks or those that are specifically mandated by the government. Export banks are authorized to offer attractive credit terms to domestic manufacturers and foreign buyers of their goods. So next, the second one, merchandise suppliers. The company's inventory or stock can be procured either through cash or credit terms. Entrepreneurs that can stock their shelves with items procured on credit terms are not only daring but smart entrepreneurs as well. Credit terms with the merchandise suppliers being a form of financing should be explored to the fullest with the merchandise suppliers. Terms like consignment basis, layaway plans, and similar arrangement can be made with the suppliers. This will spare the entrepreneurs hard cash that can be used for some other purposes or simply deposited in the bank or invested in high yielding instruments. Depending on the quality of the relationship between the company and merchandise suppliers, some suppliers provide such terms as pay when able or payment terms up to 120 days. New business ventures are also prospective business partners of merchandise suppliers, and they can be the best of friends on a long-term basis. Such relationships can be nurtured such that suppliers can provide short-term capital in terms of credit privileges for the raw materials and production inputs that are needed by the entrepreneur. The third type of creditor would be the credit card companies. Credit card is the most convenient yet the most expensive loan terms you can find in town. Credit cards are actually one of the most overlooked avenues in obtaining startup capital. Though it offers stringent term loan, it would appear as cheap no because one does not need to have business plan or collateral to get the amount needed. All that is needed by a credit card bearing entrepreneur is to walk to the ATM machine and withdraw the amount needed. If the entrepreneur is only looking at home-based business that generally needs lesser capital, the amount can be easily raised if you have several cards, or a group of 5 or more persons forming corporation can easily combine their credit card limit and instantly start the business using the credit card. For instance, a group of 5 investor or incorporators holding a Citibank Visa card or MasterCard with a 50,000 credit limit each can instantly raise 75,000 cash in a matter of minutes, which is more than enough for a small business, or they can put up a corporation with 1 million authorized capitalization with fully paid up stock portion under the minimum requirements as mandated by law. The option to tap credit card should be made with prudence and extreme precautions or a last resort because most credit card companies charge extremely high, if not exorbitant rates. So the fourth one would be the capital equipment suppliers. In their desire to sell equipment, suppliers will often make every favorable term available even to new companies. This is possible because the equipment itself secures the loan. The contract may be a lease held by the seller or leasing company, or conditional sales agreement whereby the seller retains ownership or title until the last installment payment is made and received. So next, the fifth one will be the leasing companies. They make possible the procurement of capital items or equipment for the company. This arrangement, however, can work the other way around if the entrepreneur holds the design of the capital equipment. In such case, capital equipment suppliers can make it possible for entrepreneurs to buy the equipment, especially if it is custom designed or one-of-a-kind equipment. So the sixth one is the receivable factors. There are many specialized organizations like credit and collection companies or even individuals who will take the risk of buying receivables at discounted rates. By selling the receivables, the entrepreneur is relieved of the delay and cost of collection efforts, at the same time generate funds needed by the business. So the last type of creditor would be the seventh one, deferral of payables in general. When the economy is in a difficult situation or there are industry or region-wide financial crisis, or when the money position of the company is tight, most companies lag behind in their payments of bills and loans. Entrepreneurs should not be afraid or ashamed to negotiate for payment of bills and loans by not necessarily or immediately going into reconstructing agreement. Moreover, entrepreneurs should not overlook the fact that in financial crisis periods, some of the employees might be willing to defer portions of their salary or other benefits either as gesture of solidarity, loyalty, fellowship, or practical measures to avoid being laid off. So after the short-term creditors and the types of creditors, we then move on to the next one, the venture capital companies. Venture capital companies refer to private and for-profit organizations that provide funds to new business venture by way of purchasing equity positions in new or young businesses believed to have potential to produce maximum returns within short period of time. With funding provided for by venture capital companies, the entrepreneur surrenders a portion of the ownership and control of the business as representatives of the venture capital companies generally. Like all financiers, venture capital corporations or venture capitalists are interested in the financial track record of the company in case it is an old one or the profit potential in case of the new ventures. More importantly, however, is that venture capital organizations are more concerned with the future profit potential the business investments offer. As a result, venture capital companies invest funds in returns for the share of ownership or a certain degree of control in business operations, unlike banks that are more concerned with the payment of loan amount borrowed. Other than the immediate return of investment, some venture capital companies do seek foothold trying to develop long-term capital gains. Venture capital companies hope to make an attractive profit when they sell their equity at any time they feel necessary. Because of direct involvement in the operation of the business of venture capital companies through its representative or nominees, prospective entrepreneurs have certain advantage in that they could avail of expertise of venture capitalists on the matter of overall management of the company, and more particularly on the matter of financial and marketing management. Prospective entrepreneurs can inquire with organizations of venture capital firms or commercial banks, as some of them have subsidiary corporations or establishments that operates as a venture capital organizations or which provides a similar form of services. A visit can be made also in Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas or Securities and Exchange Commission for the listing of duly authorized venture capital companies. So other sources, other than the mentioned sources, there are other fund sources, some of which are in fact more advantageous to the prospective entrepreneurs. We have 8 other sources, and those are lending investors, government institutions, non-government institutions, political sources, friends and relatives, purchase other financing, employees, and users. So first we're gonna tackle the lending investors. These are small business organization duly licensed by the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas to provide quick financing with less paperwork as compared to commercial lending sources like the banks. These organizations generally conduct a one-time credit investigation, including visits to the entrepreneur's residence and actual site of business, after which a standing credit limit is approved or considered set as a standing credit limit. Entrepreneurs' need for fund is satisfied by simply filling up application forms or contract and cash delivered thereafter and right on the spot. These organizations generally require collateral like car registration, certificates, real estate documents or certificates or land titles, or post-dated checks corresponding to the monthly or regular amortization schedule agreed upon. So the second one would be the government institutions. These are special government financing packages meant for entrepreneurs in need of funds as seed capital or assistance to those in dire need of funds like victims of calamities or highly entrepreneurial individuals. All that is needed here are endorsement by barangay officials or other forms of documentation, sometimes including submission of project studies. Though its various agencies and instrumentalities, the government has number of financing programs meant for small and medium-scale enterprises and livelihood opportunities whose terms and conditions are better off compared with that of commercial banks. So the third one would be the non-government organizations. There are non-government organizations whose mandates or major programs are really meant for upcoming small-scale entrepreneurs and providing financial assistance to the underprivileged. These NGOs charge lesser interest rates and with more noble intention as compared to commercial loan providers. An example of this NGO is the Tulay sa Pag-unlad, Heifer Project International, Plan International, and host of other NGO just waiting to be tapped for socially oriented or business venture geared towards self-help and livelihood opportunities. So the fourth one would be political sources. Relationship with politicians can go a long way. Some politicians are philanthropists and are therefore in a position to provide grants or financial assistance for self-employment and livelihood projects without bothering to pay later. Or these politicians are real entrepreneurs themselves who has the capital and resources or means to broker business deals that can lead to big ticket projects and windfall profits to entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs though have to be extra careful. However, as politicians, money and power can be used against the entrepreneur sometime later, that it might lead to repentance and frustration. So the fifth one would be friends and relatives. They are abound or just around willing to be tapped. However, not all friends are available for aid in times of financial needs, such as putting up a business project. For sure, however, most friends and relatives would be around to help or assist a budding entrepreneur for him or her to succeed in business projects. It is therefore worth it to have a network and multitude of friends or relatives only to have a multitude and variety of parties who could offer financial capital that are relatively cheap compared to commercial banking sources. So the sixth one would be purchase order financing, also called PO financing. This scheme can be arranged with commercial banks or financing institution like the Technology and Livelihood Resource Center. Standing arrangement can be made with the bank or financing institution whereby for a free, the bank will finance the production requirement of the company and upon delivery of the goods to the client. Payment will be made by the client directly to the bank or financing institution. The bank or financing institution will then retain the finance transaction plus the fees or charges and remit to the entrepreneur the amount presumed to be equivalent to his gross margin. So the next one would be employees. Never underestimate the employees. Nobody has a greater stake in health of the company other than the entrepreneur or the owner and the employees. Thus, for corporations seeking to expand capital base, possibility for having an employee stock option plan should be explored. This will not only answer the capital needs of the firm, but it could be also a vehicle for lifelong partnership between capital and labor, and would also reinforce the loyalty of the employees towards the firm. So last but not the least, the users. It may sound as a bad source of financing on account of there being illegal fund sources and charging high financing rates. Unknown to many is the fact that users have helped a thousand and more small entrepreneurs, mostly in sari-sari store business, to bankroll their daily financial needs. Unlike formal sources of funds or short-term creditors, users do not demand collaterals and business plans to avail of financing. In the long term, this scenario and their being operating illegally can work to the favor of the entrepreneurs. Unlawful as they are, they can last recourse of financial source, which in the long term could be beneficial to the entrepreneur as compared to the legally existing fund provides. So after the sources, let's get right into the next one, which is the angel investors. While it is true that entrepreneur's concern is the profit motive for himself, it is also a noble idea to share with others not only the profit aspects, but also the risk and burdens of the business. Hence, entrepreneurs may share startup capital with private investors called angels, as referred by the Entrepreneurs magazine. Unlike borrowing fresh capital from other sources who will charge you interest, money from private investors or angels are not loans or interest-bearing capital sourced outside your pocket. Enlist the support of other parties as equity investors. The equity investors themselves stand to possibly earn more rewards or interest compared to when the same money was invested elsewhere. Equity financing such as those provided by angel investors, whether they are your friends or relatives, means dividing your business ownership among investors who contribute capital, who may or may not participate in the operation or management of the business. There is no loan associated with equity capital, and there is no obligation placed on you to pay back the amount invested. All the investors get is the percentage in the profits of the business and the losses or profits associated with it. Equity capital may at first glance seems like the best way to raise your startup capital, but there are drawbacks. First, you give up a portion of your business and with it some kind of control measure that these investors may want. Second, you might unwillingly relinquish ownership or control of the company sometime in the future. So that's the last one for my part of this discussion. Thank you.
So, to continue the discussion, I'm going to discuss the stock market and the IPO. So, stock market refers to the collection of markets and exchanges where regular activities of buying, selling, and issuance of shares of publicly held companies take place. So, there can be multiple stock trading venues in a country or a region which allow transactions in stocks and other forms of securities. So from the word buying and selling. So ang company, I know nga kabalo na mo og usa ni siyang stock market. So to elaborate this, to explain like kanang gamay ra pud nga explanation is that kana bitaw nga naay stock ang usa ka company. So ang usa ka tawo is ang stock ngadto is iya siyang paliton so that kanang mahimo siya na usa sa mga shareholders sa company mo na siya gitawag nga investors. Okay. The initial public offering or the IPO refers to the process of offering shares of a private corporation to the public in a new stock issuance. An IPO allows a company to raise capital from public investors. The transitions from a private to a public company can be an important time for a private investors to fully realize gains from their investment, as it typically includes a share premium for current private investors. Meanwhile, it also allows public investors to participate in the offering. Further, para mas makasabot mo og unsay meaning anang IPO, so let's watch this video.
What is an IPO? Presented by WallStreetSurvivor.com. An initial public offering, or IPO, is the very first time a private company issues stock to the public. A company can decide to issue stock for a number of reasons, including to raise money for growth, or to allow employees, owners, and early investors to liquidate some of their shares and make money. To explain how an IPO works, let's look at Dave. Dave owns a chain of very successful food trucks in Chicago. But Dave sees a bigger future for his business and wants to expand his operation to other cities. To do so, he decides to issue shares to the public to raise the necessary cash he needs to build more trucks, inventory, marketing, and staff. Dave can't just issue stock himself to the public. He needs to use an investment bank. If the IPO is big enough, a company can use multiple investment banks. But since Dave's offering is small, he uses one, J.P. Stanley. Based on the value of Dave's company, Dave and J.P. Stanley determine the IPO price, the amount of shares they will use, and the percentage of ownership of Dave's food trucks they will give up. J.P. Stanley values Dave's food trucks at $100 million, and Dave decides to sell 10% of his company. 10% of $100 million means Dave will be raising $10 million. The investment bank decides they will be issuing $1 million in shares to the public at $10 apiece. The investment bank then lists the shares on a stock exchange for the public to buy. Investors can now buy shares of Dave's food truck. In the late 1990s, IPOs really took off as technology startups were issuing stock and raising a ton of money extremely quickly. This led to the internet bubble and subsequent collapse. You can buy publicly traded companies for free on WallStreetSurvivor.com.
So that's the meaning, that's the example of the IPO. So I hope that you learn from that. Okay, the next is understanding the IPO. So we're going to elaborate the meaning of the IPO and how is it, how to understand this in the basic nature and peculiarities of the new issues market. So there are three factors that need to be understood. So ang kinaunhan is that new stock offering tend to be underpriced relative to their trading price in the market. On average, a new stock will increase by 10 to 15% on the first day the stock traded publicly. These results are even more pronounced for smaller, younger companies going public than for their older, more established counterparts. So kung naay mga new stock markets o naay mga moabutay nga bag-o, is na yung tendency nga gatong mga daan is mohina ang mga presyo kay mura man sila mas gamay ang ilahang makuha na kwarta is kay naa may bag-o. So naay mga like ang ubang tabi og nay bag-o kay ganahan sila mo try ana, di ba? Ingana mga wala bayay sana, wala bayay ka humanan bayag mga ganahan sa tao. So they wanted to try new ingani nga na. So mao na siyang munya ang kato nga mga bag-o na stock is maka-increase siya by 10 to 15% nga i-traded siya publicly. So ang ikaduha is there are cycles in both volume of new issues and the size of the underpricing just mentioned. The periods of high average initial returns and high volume are known as hot issue markets. Thus, timing is terribly important when taking the firm public. So, og ganahan jud ka like, di ba maghimo jud ka og market research kon kanang sana sakto ba na siya na like oras or like day or months nga anha nimo ipagawas imong product, ipapublic nimo, dapat na adjud kay timing ana nga kuan kay nabayaban nga if ever like sa isda kay og magdungan-dungan siya is nay posible nga dili mahalin imuha, di ba? So kanang dapat jud timing nimo nga gamay rag isda ay nga na para dili ka para halin diretso. So ikatulo is new issues tend to underperform for up to 5 years after the offering, both in terms of the firm's stock price performance. These results are even more pronounced for younger firms than for established. Okay, the next is the IPO process. So making the company public via initial public offering follows administrative processes. Following is a brief but factual description of this process. Kung ganahan ka ang imong company ma-public pinaagi sa initial public offering or sa IPO, kay naa kay mga proseso nga dapat buhaton or dapat sundon or like that. So ang kinahanglan is that it takes 6 months to 2 years ang pagproseso. Naay ang pinakasayo is 6 months kay na-organize na sila through financially and everything nga pagpakita sa IPO nga okay na ni sila. So mao ang sayo ang ilahang paghimo nga public ilang company. Naa sayo ban nga moabot pog 8 months. 6 months o 8 months maabot sila nga na sa mahimong public ilang company. Unya nganong maabot siya og 2 years nga process o sa mahimo silang public is because dili pa sila organized ilang financial na pa sila yung problema ing ana nga dapat i-organize sa nila maong mo take sila og 2 years usa pa sila mahimong public. So ang ikaduha is interfacing with attorneys, auditors, underwriters, and financial printers, collecting information for the realms of documentation that need to be submitted. So nag-needed siya or like dapat na amoy ika-present na mga tao or dapat na amoy mga tao nga dapat mo'y mulihok sa inyong papel, mga documentation or like mga mga papel nga dapat need nga i-submit for o sana siya sa process nga dapat buhaton o ganahan ka nga mahimong public ang imuhang company. And then ang ikatulo is slideshow, product brochures, and videos will be produced and distributed. So, mo siya maong nana siya yung mga usa na siya sa ka-process nga kuan sa IPO is that ang kana mga slideshow napo na siya yung mga road shows, mga product brochures kana sila is ihatag na siya kung ang imong company is like pila na lang ka days like 2 days usa mahimong public ay panghatag na sila og mga brochures or like magpa-advertise sila sa TV ing ana ang usa sa mga buhaton nila para manotice na ma-public na ni siya ingani og makabantay mo nga nay mga bag-ong advertisement nga mo pop up ra kalit sa TV ing ana na sila wala ta kabalo nga pila ka days kay public na day sila. And then ikaupat is that you need to answer these questions if ganahan ka nga mahimo kang public kung ganahan ka nga mahimong public imong company. So ang kinahanglan is that what do we need to do before going public? What are the legal requirements? Who should be responsible for the different activities and how? Should we structure our team to make it all happen? How do we choose an investment banker? How do we determine the appropriate price for the offering? How will life be different after we are a public company? So mao to siya, sayo na siya mga questions. If desidido gyud ka, if kanang kay daghan man jud dapat og kuti o ganahan kag kuan ba kay dili na siya dali-dali. So mao na siya imong dapat nga mga buhaton o ganahan ka nga mahimong public imuhang company na kay mga pang-ansiran, and it takes 6 to 2 years nga mahimo kang public. And then taking a company public is one of the most exhilarating, frustrating, stimulating, and exhausting experiences owners and managers will ever encounter. So, kulba gyud siya if ganahan ka kay di ba og maghimo mayon kag public is that daghan nagtawo kanang daghan nagtawo nga mo involve or daghan nagtawo nga makabalo, daghan nagtawo nga like musod or gawas ana. So daghan jud kag ma-feel nga kanang it's normal ra gyud ni siya if kanang you are into business gyud kay I think sa tanan man siguro maka-feel kag ma-frustrate ka even sa exam, di ba? Even sa test, even sa mga gipangbuhat nimo sa adlaw-adlaw na mga panagsa nga ma-frustrate ka. It's just the same when it comes to business o sa ingana o ganahan ka mahimong public jud imong company is maka-feel jud kag mga ingana. And then the IPO begins with an entrepreneur's decision to go public and take the plunge in IPO. The entrepreneur then selects an investment banker to serve as underwriter, who in return brings together a group investment house to help sell the shares. So, ang entrepreneurs gihapon ang magkuan o ganahan siya i-public ang iyang company. O niya siya po'y mag-select og like sa investment banker nga kanang tabangan siya nga ibaligya ang kato mga shares ingana if ganahan ka nga mahimong public imong company. Whenever you are negotiating, it always good to know the underlying motivation for the other side. In this case, you need to understand the investment banker's incentives for assisting with an IPO. O usa ka company, dapat mag-search jud ka or like dapat sabton jud nimo ang usa ka bank or like mag-open mo og bank account or anything nga naghisgot og kwarta o ingana isat kabalo jud mo sa mga incentives ana dapat sabton jud ninyo para walay daghang pangutana o walay daghang para dili ka maingon nga scam na siya ingana. Okay. Going public via IPO means accommodating new business owners or partners the entrepreneur has never known. So, sa pagkuan pa lang nimo nga imo ganahan ka nga public imo nga company or like business is naadjog kay makaila or like makasugat na mga negosyante sad mga bagong tag-iya sa negosyo nga wala pa nimo nahibal-an or wala pa nimo nakaila ingana. Once the firm has been sold, taken public, or merged with a larger corporation as part of the strategic alliance, and once the money or stock has changed hands, the entrepreneur is a free person. Kung ang kumpanya gibaligya na, gihiusa na sa mas dako nga korporasyon unya gikuha na sad sa publiko, ang kato nga entrepreneur is free na siya. And lastly, the entrepreneur has the financial means to do essentially what he wants to do when he wants to do it.
So Anna already discussed about what an IPO is, or the initial public offering. For more information, please watch this video, and for you also to know why does company go to public.
An IPO is an initial public offering. It's the first time a stock is offered for sale to the general population.
Now, the reason they do this is because they want to raise capital. So like most companies, they usually start out from humble beginnings and they're usually small, but as time goes on, they usually get bigger and then they require a lot more capital to operate and get to that next step, which is to become a big corporation. Part of becoming that big corporation is issuing shares into the public. So when a company first issues shares to the public, this is called the initial public offering. So when a company first issues shares into the public, they're giving up ownership or equity in return for money. You will have management operate the companies like the CEOs and the board of executives, but the ownership is with the stockholders, everyday regular people. This is essentially the very basic fundamental reason why companies go public. They need money to operate and get bigger. That's essentially it. And it often depends on the characteristic of the business. So for example, banks and airline companies are notoriously known for always being public because these are referred to as capital intensive businesses, meaning they require a lot of capital. Where do they get that capital? Well, it's best to go into the public. Why is it best to do this? Because it's free. When you go to the bank, you have to pay off debt. Where else are you going to get this money? You give equity into your company. You have no obligation to pay them back. It's a risk that a shareholder is making. They're going to ride the successes with you in the company, and they may be subject to the fall and the failures with you. Now, the process of becoming public is actually very simple to comprehend if you look at it from a broad perspective. You have a company, and they are looking to go public. At the time they are going public, they probably just have a few owners. However, when they're done with this process, they'll probably have millions. So the company does two things first. One, they go to the SEC to get authorization, and the SEC goes over the company and they authorize how many shares they can issue. This is called the authorized shares. And then they often go to one of the big investment banks, and this is what investment banks primarily specialize in. They hire the investment bank to go over all these complex financial metrics by these highly trained business professionals, and once they derive all these formulas, the investment bank decides how many shares to issue and at what price. And investment banks are usually compensated on a commission basis. The company wants to ensure that the IPO process is successful, and it's up to the investment bank to make sure that happens. So the company will only pay depending on how successful this is. There are times throughout history where an investment bank has essentially become a failure in trying to IPO a company. What would be a failure in the IPO process? It would be when they try to issue shares, nobody buys them, and therefore they don't raise the capital that they need. So when the investment bank does attract heat in the market to buy these shares, they first go through what's called the primary market. The primary market is made up of a few big institutions and key financial players that are essentially just first in line to buy up these shares. Once they exit the primary market, they enter what's called the secondary market. Now, the secondary market is the market you are familiar with. This is the market that's reported on the news. This is the market that has a lot of participants and goes through the daily and minute-to-minute fluctuations. The participants in the market are institutional and retail investors, whereas in the primary market, they're mostly just authorized institutional investors. And what you have to understand is once they're in the secondary market, where the share price goes doesn't actually affect the capital raised by the company. They make their money in the primary market. Once it enters the secondary market, what happens to the share price actually doesn't affect the performance of the company. And then it becomes a reverse process. The performance of the company actually affects the shares. Now, there are some funny things that happen in the financial markets. When a company is authorized amount of shares, they almost never issue them all at once. You'll see oftentimes on a stock exchange a company will have Class A shares and Class B shares and Class C shares, etc. This usually just represents different periods of time where a company has gone through a couple of IPO processes. When a company is given their authorized shares, they usually just give a small piece into the public first. They want to get a good idea of sentiment and they want to hold on to the rest of the shares for future causes. It's essentially just smart corporate governance. So this was just a short topic I wanted to cover because it's a very important part of corporate finance and the stock market, but a lot of people don't know exactly how it works.
So, to summarize, an IPO is an initial public offering. It is when the companies sell their shares to the public. First, they need authorization from the SEC or a different securities regulatory body. And then we hire investment banks goes through the process of raising capital. It goes into the primary market first, which consists of institutional investors and big key players, and it then trickles down to the secondary market, which consists of retail investors. Why do they go to public? To raise capital. And why do they need to raise capital? To expand and fund further growth and become a bigger business. So, entrepreneurs have been benefited a lot, but there are also risks in going public. There are two major disappointments mentioned by entrepreneurs who have sold their companies by going public. First, entrepreneurs lose focus and direction. They lose focus and direction which had been provided by owning a company. even for those with basic value system that reminds them that they are not their work and naadyo'y bigger chances for emotional downtime. And naapoy ubang entrepreneurs nga nagmahay nganong gibaligya nila ang ilang company even if naka-receive sila of fair price. And they came to realize that the firm serves as the base for much that what they did both in and out of the business area. So second is managing liquidity resulting from company sale becomes burden for some entrepreneurs. So in the area, they find managing liquidity difficult and less enjoyable than what they expected and less rewarding than owning their own company. So some people take out loan to buy a house and some people take out loans to buy a car. When you borrow money, it means you are in debt. In other words, you owe money. But before a bank will give you a loan, they will make a credit test. So if you do not owe money and already repaid your loans, it means you have a high credit rating or high credit score. If you owe a lot of money and haven't repaid your loans, it means you have a low credit rating or low credit score. In short, magbasa sila sa imong performance sa imong pag-repay sa imong loan. But there are things that bank can do para maka-make sure sila nga mabalik ang kwarta nila. So number 1 is collateral. So what do you mean by collateral? So it is something that you promise to give the bank if you can't pay your loan. So for example, si Shaina Aliago ni loan og 5 million sa bangko. And iyang gipusta ang iyahang mansion dito sa Alegria. So if ever si Shaina dili ka pay sa iyahang 5 million nga giutang, so katong balay or katong mansion is foreclosed. Other one is banks may ask for cosign. So for example, si Gracia ni loan og 500,000 pesos and wala siya collateral. But ang gipangita sa bangko is someone nga mo co-sign, which is if dili kabayad si Gracia sa iyahang gilon, responsible na siya or ang kana na pong ni co-sign maoy mo bayad bali mo pasa. So if ever ang iyang gipa-co-sign si Anafe, so kana si Anafe kung dili kabayad si Gracia, si Anafe ang magpadayon og bayad sa gilon ni Gracia. To be able to get financing from the banks, it should be a great help that a loan applicant or an entrepreneur have a clear and ready answer to these following questions that a banker may pose. Number 1, how much money you really want to have? Number 2, what are you going to do with the money? Number 3, why is the loan needed for the business? Number 4, why do you need our depositors' money? Number 5, when will you pay back your loan? Number 6, how will you repay your loan? And number 7, what happens if your plans do not work out?
Introducing the 5 C's of credit. The 5 C's of credit is a system used by lenders to gauge the credit worthiness of a potential borrower. The system weighs 5 characteristics of the borrower and condition of the loan, attempting to estimate the chance of default. The 5 C's of credit are: character. It is the obligation that a borrower feels to repay the loan. Since there is not an accurate way to judge a character, the lender will decide subjectively whether or not you are sufficiently trustworthy to repay the loan. Capacity. It refers to your ability to meet the loan payments. The prospective lender will want you to know exactly how you intend to repay the loan. The lender will consider the cash flow from the business, the timing of repayment, and the probability of successful repayment of the loan. Capital. It is the money invested in the business and is an indicator of how much is at risk should be the business fail. Lenders will generally consider the company's debt-to-equity ratio to understand how much money the lender is being asked to lend in relation of how much the owners have invested. Conditions. It refers to the intended purpose of the loan, for example, working capital, additional equipment, or new offices. The size of loan in relation to the specific use will help the lender evaluate your loan request. Collateral. It is a form of security for the lender. Banks usually require collateral as a type of insurance in case you cannot repay the loan. If you default on the loan, then the lender takes possession of the collateral in place of the debt. These methods of evaluating a borrower incorporates a qualitative and quantitative measures. Lenders look at the borrower's credit reports, credit scores, income statement, and other documents relevant to the borrower's financial situation, and they also consider information about the loan itself.
Most entrepreneurs face. There are many options: the small business loans, investors, small business grants, self-financing, crowdfunding, but the process of zeroing in the one funding option that is the best for your business may not be clear-cut process. So, what are some things you should consider when you're looking for a capital to start for your business? So, the biggest question is, should you fund your business yourself, or should you use other people's money to get your business off the ground? Other people's money refers to the borrowed capital that is used to increase the potential returns as well as the risk of the investment. It comes in many forms, including bank loans, investors, family and friends, venture capital and angel investors, crowdfunding, and venture financing or leasing. Using other people's money also buys you time and allows you to do things in your business you may not have been able to do if you financed yourself. You have more options, increased reach, and the ability to make a bigger impact much quicker as you start a business. Author Gigi Green insinuates that if the business is successful, you will have your cash to help it grow and expand. If your business is unsuccessful, then you will have some cash left to build another business. So when we say capitalism, it is all about a system in which professional business operates, utilizes other people's money for mutual gain. He also emphasized that successful businessmen seldom operate their own money.